In today's fast-paced, chaotic world of modern technology, scientific advances, and instant information, what does it matter that 500 years ago, a lone monk, armed with his 95 church grievances and theological arguments, would ignite what would be called the Reformation? The more we look and the deeper we dig, we find the impact of that day surrounding us more than we may realize. October 31st, 1517, an unknown monk named Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses onto the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. More than an argument against clerical abuses and corrupt church practices, the 95 Theses became a catalyst for wide-ranging changes in not just the church, but also the political system and society itself. And these changes still affect us today. I'm your host, Sandy Miller, on our journey to uncover the impact of the Reformation today. The wages of sin is death. But while here on earth, the punishments for sins can be alleviated through penance. In the early church, penance was only used in rare circumstances. But by Luther's day, it was a common practice required of all Christians. Penance are acts performed by the sinner to lessen punishment and gain forgiveness. The severity of the penance depends on the seriousness of the sin. From the mild, reading devotions or the Bible, fasting, reciting chants or prayers, to the more extreme, wearing a cilice or even self-flagellation. By the 10th century, penance can include making trips to holy places called pilgrimages, or viewing relics with special holy powers, even buying indulgences, pieces of paper with the power of forgiveness.
Late medieval Catholicism provided all kinds of ways of trying to make sense. I don't want to sound too sort of intellectualist here, but to deal with it, to cope with it, right? You could go on pilgrimage, you could pray for healing, there were relics, there were shrines. This was all about trying to deal with the misfortune that people experienced. And so if you take those away, well, what's in its place?
By the 1500s, Pope Leo encourages the sale of indulgences as a way to raise money for the church, specifically building the extravagant Basilica of St. Peter. A monk named John Tetzel is given the territory of Germany to persuade the people there into buying indulgences to help fund this church in Rome. He convinces the people that when you buy indulgences, you are buying forgiveness. This infuriates Martin Luther.
And he has to clear the function of the word of absolution. And first, he understood the absolution. I absolve you from your sin as a declarative act, a speech act in a declarative sense. And in a second step, in an efficacious sense, as verbum efficax, as a word which does what it says. I deliver you from sin, and the sins are forgiven. Speaking this in the authority in the name of God.
He had shifted the definition of what it means to be a Christian from basically a ritual-based religion, a religion that tries to approach God on the basis of human, not just works in general, but sacred good works, especially in participation or attendance at the Mass.
Luther, he's not just attacking indulgences, he's attacking the way in which people are misunderstanding indulgences and the way in which this preaching undermines the gospel itself.
One of the ways that the church taught people to understand suffering and to try to seek to cope with it was to view the actual suffering that they experienced, even sort of daily toil by which you get your daily bread, as a kind of penance. And if you endured it patiently and faithfully, didn't murmur and grumble like the children of Israel, This could reduce time in purgatory. This could help reform your character and help conform you more to the image of Christ, rendering satisfaction for sin along with Christ's merit for sin. And you can find pastoral manuals, confession manuals, where lay people are specifically instructed to ask their confessors, I've endured this suffering, please count it to me as a penance for my sin. Well, Luther posed that doesn't work with justification by faith, because all penance has been paid for by Christ. Everything has been paid for by Christ. And so, well, what's left then? Luther could still talk about suffering as a means of conforming one to Christ. He could still talk about it as a means of developing compassion for other people as they suffered, so that one could understand their suffering. First and foremost, though, it was a test of faith.
That's what the Reformation is always about. It's about the reform of preaching. It's about getting the gospel out to all the people so that they understand what the mercy of God is, and that it's not something for sale.
Every sermon has the function to set free, to free the sinner, and to say you are free, don't fear.
Society before the Reformation consists of a complex interweaving of nobility with other societal statuses. It is not a simple lower class, upper class system. But the Reformers give people a new sense of their own worth and identity. And while not altering the structure of the social system at the time, people stand taller with an altered perception of their own dignity. This higher opinion of self-worth is still prevalent in today's society. In the Middle Ages, people considered their work as a means of survival, work or die. To have a calling meant to do churchly work, be a priest or a monk. But the Reformers turned this philosophy upside down.
The very term vocation itself, of course, just comes from the Latin vocare, to call, and to literally is to call something. So the vocation is the sense that God has called you. He's given you this to do. It's a calling from God.
Now the term calling was a word that in medieval Europe had been restricted to the callings of the church. The monks, the nuns, the priests had callings. The other people did not.
For Luther, one does not have to leave society to follow God or to be honoring God, but one has to be involved in society. This is huge, especially when you think about the Middle Ages, when anybody who was going to be really serious about doing the God thing or kind of get right with God, you had to forsake family, you had to forsake connections in this world and go join a monastery. Basically, that was the track. You had to do the God track. And the idea of a person staying in this life and trying to be God-pleasing, that was just kind of like, you can't do this. So when Luther comes to the realization that, no, in fact, obedience to God means doing what God put you here to do, which means being involved in this world, this was huge. It was essentially redefining the entire culture he was living in. It was changing the way everybody saw everything. And instead of having to join the monastery to be serious about being right with God, I could simply be a good father.
Most of the population lived in the household, in the oikonomia. They were the farmers and the artisans and the merchants and everybody else. A small percentage of the population, though perhaps larger than we would guess in some big cities, at least 10–15% of the population, lived in the church. They were monks, nuns, priests. And then a very, very small percent lived in the political office of the rulers. And you had one area of responsibility. Luther came to see that that wasn't the case at all.
For Luther, vocations primarily are rooted not so much in your vocation as in your career or your occupation, something you do to get money. Your vocation's more into the thing that God has called you to do. And so for Luther, it's always grounded in family relationships. Who's my father? Who's my mother? Who are my siblings? And then where am I living? Who are my neighbors? What do I owe these people around me? That's where vocation starts.
We have family responsibilities, economic responsibilities, occupational responsibilities. We have societal responsibilities, and we have responsibilities in the church. And each one of us has a unique set of responsibilities to the family circle, the occupational circle, the societal circle around us. I think that's still very helpful in talking about the structure of life.
Your calling is your purpose in life, not merely the way you make a living.
Luther saw that the spiritual class, the priests, the monks, the bishops, were no better in God's eyes than the non-spiritual class. Well, then the way was open to view all sorts of vocations as ways to serve God and neighbor and to please God and neighbor. Let's say a baker wanted to serve God better. Luther would say, do a better job at what you do then. Make sure the bread is baked in a very fine way. Make sure you don't charge too much for it so people can't afford it. Make sure that your bread, in fact, goes for nourishment and that you deal fairly with all people. He would tell a mother, love your children and raise them up to be good Christians and good citizens.
The purpose of vocation is to love and serve your neighbor.
The real goal is on the vocation, your calling, no matter what. And I really define the difference as being that's work, job, career, profession, and it has your name on it. You can switch professions, but if you have a vocation, you write out unemployment, you write out being overpraised or everything else. And that's at the heart of Luther's whole concept of life and daily life.
You know, people often credit the Puritan work ethic with the, America's greatness, but really the Puritan work ethic is just grounded in Luther's doctrine of vocation. Had Luther not given this, there would be no Puritan work ethic. It's not Calvin's idea, it's really Luther who's saying, go do what God's giving you to do and giving you the freedom to do that.
But I think Luther's societal theory, as stuck in the Middle Ages as it was, is still very dynamic and very useful for talking about the worth of human life and the dignity of every individual in our individual sets of callings. I think that works today.
God does not need our good works, but our neighbor does. Before the Reformation, the role of the family, of one's body, even sex, is marginalized. In fact, 1 in 4 people have taken vows of celibacy, considered to be the greatest religious aspiration. But Martin Luther radically challenges this. He preaches that to be married is the epitome of religious life, going so far as to say that procreation is the greatest work of human beings. His ideas tear into the very fabric of society. Celibacy is out, procreation is in. In the Middle Ages, the celibate life is considered more holy than married life. This belief leads 25% of the people to celibacy.
In the late 15th century and early 16th century, approximately 1 in 4 people had taken a vow of celibacy. 25% of the population are seeing marriage, both socially and religiously, as something to be avoided.
The Middle Ages had placed marriage, it wasn't evil, but it was on a lower scale than celibacy. Celibacy was a holier way of life. And Luther said, no, we've practiced celibacy just to earn our way into heaven, so it was a matter of his basic understanding of our way of salvation. But it was also part of his doctrine of creation, that he has created us in the family and created the family to nurture a human life and bring us up in the fear and admonition of the Lord.
By the time you get to the late Middle Ages, there clearly is an established hierarchy of what it means to be religious. In the late Middle Ages, to be religious is to follow this monastic pattern, to follow these vows of celibacy, obedience, and poverty. In particular, the interpretation of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and his dialogue with the rich man was used to justify these 2 different tiers of Christianity, these 2 types of religious life. When Jesus met the rich man asked, "What must I do to enter eternal life?" And Jesus says, "You know the 10 commandments, follow those." And his response was that, "I have done all these since my youth." So then Jesus responded, "If you would be perfect, sell all you have, give to the poor, and come follow me." The church took this dialogue between Jesus and the rich man and interpreted it as talking about 2 different types of religious life. On the one hand, you had people who, living their life in the world, tried to be obedient to the Ten Commandments, and through that kind of life would eventually enter into the kingdom of God. And then there were those people who would be perfect, and they had an advanced spiritual status. They followed Jesus' more strict counsels and commandments. Luther ends up turning this whole notion of a two-tiered Christianity upside down. Instead of the monks or the priests being the spiritual class and lay people being a secular class, Luther recognized that baptism in the Scriptures described all people as priests. This is what truly made you religious. This is what truly made you spiritual. And the role of a bishop or a cleric or a monk was really an issue of human invention, an issue of order, and not an issue of spiritual status.
Once Luther had realized that the spiritual class, the priests, the monks, the bishops, were no better in God's eyes than the non-spiritual class, well, then the way was open to view all sorts of vocations as ways to serve God and neighbor and to please God and neighbor. One of those vocations was the vocation of the family, marriage and family.
The calling of family life, in a sense, replaced the monastic and priestly callings for Luther at the very core of God's plan for society. In the Large Catechism, he says, essentially, if nothing works in the family, nothing else in society will work either.
Father and mother in the family were seen as both having callings from God. These were vocations. They were just as holy as any calling to be a priest or a monk or a pope or a bishop.
As baptized children of God, they all can stand before God on account of Christ. They have roles as parents, father and mother in the home, and they become, in effect, kind of the pastor, the priest and the priestess, as it were, in the home for family purposes.
More religious than the monastic life is the married life. Married life is the epitome of religious life.
As the institution of marriage develops in the Middle Ages, it becomes one of the 7 sacraments of the Church. Martin Luther views marriage from a different perspective.
For Luther, marriage is not actually a churchly act. It's rooted in creation, in the broader life of humanity. In a sense, it's there before there's even a church. It's instituted in Genesis 1, and therefore marriage is something that's rooted in creation, not in redemption. Marriage is outside of the church. Pagan marriages, according to Luther, are still valid because they carry out God's intention in the first article of the Creed, that human beings would be fruitful and multiply. And this was seen as the bedrock of all social structures.
Be fruitful and multiply is more than a command. It is a divine ordinance of work which is not our prerogative to hinder or ignore. It is not a matter of free choice or decision, but a natural and necessary thing.
By putting marriage into the civic and social sphere, then, it's regulated not by churchly canon law, but rather by the state, by social and civic norms. So much would this be the case that Luther would see marriage as something that happens outside the church, in the civic sphere. And then, perhaps you would go into the church and receive a blessing and celebrate that marriage. Thus, Luther interprets marriage as an institution rooted in natural law and in nature. In his commentaries on Genesis, he reflected how in the Garden of Eden, after the praise of God, marriage and procreation would have been the greatest work of human beings.
Martin Luther is centuries ahead of his time in his writings on the role of fathers.
I confess to thee that I am not worthy to rock this little babe or wash its diapers, or to be entrusted with the care of the child and its mother. How is it that I, without any merit, have come to the distinction of being certain that I am serving thy creature and thy more precious will? Oh, how gladly I will do so.
In many ways, the way that a Christian is going to be most closely conformed to the image of Christ is through washing diapers and caring for kids and just sort of dealing with all kinds of things that are uncontrollable in family life. I think one of the biggest differences between the monastic life that he experienced and family life is that in monastic life, one is still in a sense in control of what's happening because there's a daily regimen and you know what's coming. Now, I mean, it's a human community, so there's unexpected things happening. But nonetheless, it's the regimen, the routine is essential to the spirituality. Well, when you've got, young kids crawling around the floor and who knows what hour they're waking you up at night, you're not in control of this. You're not in control of that experience. So I think in that way, Luther's borrowing of this language from the monastery and applying it to the family life, that shows an important transition in the spirituality. He recognizes that there is a new sphere here. I mean, there were other people who were writing about this before Luther as well, but Luther especially emphasizes family as a primary sphere of spiritual development. And I think that's something that's still extremely important for today.